So you have a PhD in conservation conflict. What drew you to that?
Really good question. Yeah, it still feels a bit weird when people say to me, "You have a PhD," even though it was a year and a half ago. Yeah, so it's a funny story. My career's been slightly wonky. I always say so. It was never really a clear trajectory. So I started out as a marine scientist. So I did a marine biology degree. I specialised in marine mammal habitat use. And then I kind of had an idea of I wanted to go off on a sort of filmmaking career. That was where I was heading. And then just gradually, as I kind of was working through my masters, I started to kind of figure out, well, where can I make the most difference? So what are the biggest problems that we're seeing cropping up time and time again? And something that I'd experienced, going through my undergraduate degree and then going into the masters. And I did a little bit of work out in South Africa. So I worked there for a couple of months, and we were coming up time and time again against this thing called conflict, which a lot of us assume to be when humans or wildlife are having an adverse impact on one another. And what we try and do naturally is mitigate that impact. So try and either keep humans and wildlife away from each other, or, try and limit the impacts that wildlife are having on human lives and livelihoods. And I kind of fell into that trap a little bit. So I got really, really interested in those dynamics. But kind of as time went on and, I got more interested in the subject, I began to realize that, these things weren't really working. So we were coming up against scientific barriers, we're coming up against policy barriers. And also people kind of weren't really responding very well to those interventions. So I met a guy called Steve Redpath, who we would call the godfather of conservation conflicts. He came up with the term. And he just went into his office and was having kind of conversations with him about the subject area. And I said, I'm really, really interested in learning a bit more about this. And I wanted to make a film on it. And he said, well, actually, have you ever thought about doing a PhD? And I was like, no, not really, not for me. I'm not into the academic sort of lifestyle. And he sent one of his students to kind of chat to me, and she did a lot of kind of filmmaking and SciComm stuff on the side. And she kind of said to me, if you're really interested in this subject, then that's the route you should go down for a PhD. That's what a PhD is all about, is kind of getting really into one subject. So I decided to explore the world of conservation conflicts a little bit more, because it seemed to me as one of these big, very important problems that we don't really have an answer to just yet in the conservation sphere. So yeah, I kind of decided to do a PhD.
Why?
Went against the grain.
Why not? And it's not as black and white as people think, is it?
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. So as I was saying earlier, we kind of we assume these problems we either assume they're between humans and wildlife, so humans are being impacted by wildlife or vice versa, or we tend to think of them as kind of like a conflict between interest groups. So we see there being, say for example, there's agriculture or game shooting or hunting, which we see as kind of like I wouldn't say an anti-conservation interest, but it's sort of like a different interest. And then you have conservation on the other side of it. So we see these two sort of separate interest groups, and we see conflict as these two interest groups sort of not being able to see eye to eye and coming to loggerheads with one another. So our obvious route to try and solve these problems is to either figure out a compromise or figure out a way that one side can be appeased. So whether that's, the introduction of protective legislation, or whether that's providing compensation to a farmer that's experiencing negative impacts. But quite often that's not the whole story. So I like to describe conflicts as kind of like an iceberg. So what I've just described there, that's really what's on the surface. So that's what we talk about all the time. They're very visible impacts. So things like, financial problems, or, something that's very, very easy to see and record. But what we don't see is the stuff underneath the surface. So this is kind of all the less visible parts. And that's the stuff that will sink the ship eventually if we don't address it properly and we don't navigate it. And all this stuff underneath the surface is the more social and political issues. So I like to call them the sort of messy human side, as it were, and they're often not easily connected to conservation. So you might have something that's happened, way in the past, that's fractured relationships and created tensions, but that's brought forwards to now. It's just not talked about, but it affects how people react with one another and how people react towards conservation interventions. For example, they might feel, for example, in Europe, you've got a big conflict with wolves over there, especially in Scandinavia, where, you're getting levels of predation, or people are worried about the impacts that wolves are going to have. But a lot of researchers have actually found out that the resistance toward the wolf isn't just about impacts on livestock, for example. It's due to a kind of feeling of the state trying to oppress rural livelihoods, and a lot of the resistance comes from that. So this is the kind of thing that makes it extremely messy and very, very hard to understand. And so we tend to miss those aspects, even though they are quite a big part of it. They are the root causes of the conflict.